Welcome to another edition of Inside Government. I'm Cedric Peterson. This time in our program, we'll be discussing a little bit about the weather. And my guest in the studio is none other than the head of the Met Department, St. Martin, Mr. Joseph Isaac, meteorologist and head of the department. Mr. Isaac, it's good to have you again. We do our annual interview. It's great to have you in studio.
It's always good to be here to try and impact some knowledge to the public. We always understand that the media, we have to work very closely with the media, as the media is a conduit to get the information out to the public. So we welcome being here, and we know we have to do it all the time. We keep repeating things that are important. It's not always good for us to have the information and not be able to get it to the public. The only way to get it to the public is through the media, so we always welcome those occasions.
And I want to start off by apologizing to, of course, our more seasoned listeners and viewers who are quite familiar with weather and maybe sometimes self-proclaimed meteorologists out there. But we're going to start with some basic questions for those who want to get a good start in the knowledge of meteorology. First and foremost, tell us a little bit about the role and the task of meteorology in St. Martin.
Okay, the role of meteorology in St. Martin is simple, and we have to be aware that the role has changed. Previously, it was the Meteorological Department of the Netherlands Antilles, and you'd appreciate after 10-10-10 that was changed. And because we at the time St. Martin didn't have the capacity, Curacao was contracted to do a lot of the work for St. Martin in terms of meteorology. But it was a government view to always be dependent. And from 2013, January 2013, all the meteorological services, that is aviation meteorology, marine meteorology, and meteorology to the public in terms of weather forecast, warning, etc., all been done by St. Martin. So St. Martin is fully dependent on providing all the meteorological services for St. Martin.
St. Martin and the citizens are aware that the Met Office is located down at the Princess Juliana International Airport, and as you mentioned, aviation is a part of the work of meteorologists. Now, tell us, how does the aviation factor work? What exactly is involved in that process?
Yeah, a lot of times people get kind of confused as to what area and how things work. When we say public meteorology for the public, we would be talking about the general forecast, what is expected, the weather today, the high temperature, low temperatures. When we talk about marine meteorology, we'll be talking about the sea conditions. The aviation part can be very complex, depending on the nature of the service you provide. And again, it depends on the nature of your airport. So we would understand that the St. Martin, Princess Juliana International Airport, you have a number of flights that go to all parts of the world and so on. And as a result, your meteorological services would have to be in tune to provide that sort of service. So we are full-fledged forecast office. And for example, with aviation meteorology, that's why we have different sections in the meteorological department. So you would have the observers. The observers are sort of like the eye for the pilot on the ground. They work very closely with the air traffic controllers. Those would be the persons who every hour would do a weather observation, say what type of clouds are in the sky, the height of the clouds, give the temperature, the wind direction and speed, which is very critical for aircraft landing and takeoff. They work 24/7. Then you have the forecasters. The forecasters are the ones who would say what the weather is expected to be. So they would be involved in the public weather, marine, and aviation forecast in terms of, for example, a plane is going across to Europe. The forecasters would be the ones that would do what we call flight folders, so that any aircraft, for example, leaving St. Martin and going across to Europe would know what would be the conditions along the route. What would be the wind direction and speed as you go up in the atmosphere, what would be the temperature and so on. And those things have a lot to do with the amount of fuel an aircraft would take, the amount of time it would take, whether you have a headwind or a tailwind. Sometimes you hear persons on a flight and they say, oh boy, this time the flight, we took less time because the pilot really pushed it, not knowing that it's just a matter of whether the winds were favorable or not favorable. And that's the kind of data we assimilate to provide information to pilots so that they can chart their course wherever they're going.
Seems interesting, too, along the lines of when you see a plane take off from what we know is the opposite direction of the runway. What causes that?
What happens is that aircrafts are supposed to take off with the wind against the aircraft. You really do not want the wind towards the back of the aircraft. When they're landing, they would also need to land with the wind coming towards the head of the aircraft. And that is where, depending on the wind conditions, they could use any end of the runway. We call that whichever active end of the runway. So, for example, if the winds are very light, they could choose to use any end of the runway. But again, if the winds are up, depending on the direction of the wind, they would have to choose or be directed by the air traffic controllers which end of the runway to use. Our observers do not speak directly to the pilots. They provide the information to the air traffic controllers, and the air traffic controllers would be the ones to guide the pilots in terms of weather conditions. Things are changing drastically. Before, a lot of the information would become from the Met Office. More and more, you have less information coming from the Met Office to the tower because we use a lot of automation. So our automatic weather station would provide a lot of the information directly into the tower so they can see things on a minute-to-minute basis in real time.
Break down the marine aspect for us now in regards to meteorology and the coverage of weather as it affects the marine sector. How does that work?
Okay, as you know, we have a website, and we provide that sort of information on our website. There are a number of activities in terms of yachting, in terms of when we have the Heineken and regatta. The organizers will always call to find out what would be the winds like around that time. Individual persons having their yachts and doing business will also want to know what would be the wind conditions. You also need to know what are the sea conditions like for boating. So we provide that sort of information. And we also do watches and warnings for sea users in terms of persons going to the beach. If we know that there's a possibility of rip currents, or if the sea swells are going to be high, because what you can find happening is that sometimes the sea can be very flat out, and then you have significant waves onshore. So we try our best to provide that sort of information so persons can be guided. And we remember earlier this year in April, and that's the sort of fight we have with social media, when something was going around saying that the Met Office said not to go to the beach. And you know how important it is for persons around Easter time to go to the beach. We actually had a warning in terms of high seas and asking people to exercise caution. But the warning of not going to the beach came from another Met service when we discovered. But then with social media, it was just copied, and it was going all around the place, like it was the St. Martin Met service putting that out. So these are the sort of things that we want to remind people all the time. You know, we put out information, and persons must know where to get information so that it can be reliably. Because with social media now, anybody can basically put one or two graphs together and sound like a meteorologist, and people can be just thrown off the ball. Just recently, we had the instance where there was this YouTube thing going around about someone predicting that we're going to get a mega storm because of some developments in the Atlantic. And we had the Met Office. From the time we looked at it and we looked at the analysis, what the person was saying, we noticed that it was not based on science in terms of the meteorological fact. But the person was very fluent. And if you didn't know meteorology, I mean, you would just go on a ride. And where was the mega storm? It never happened. You know, so while we generally encourage persons that it is important, social media is there, there's a lot of good information there. You can go out and seek information there. You have to be very careful as to where you get information, because there's no one policing social media. So I can post anything, you know, and if I'm convincing and so on, you would say, well, what I'm saying is true, you know, and that's why we always say go to the official sites of the meteorological services and get the information. When you, for example, would listen to a weather advisory from the National Hurricane Center, which we work with very closely, all the advisories, at the end of the advisory, they say for local conditions relevant to your country, seek information from the National Weather Service. And that's what we work with. So that is what we want people to get into a mood of knowing where to get information. And not only where to get information, I think a lot of times, and we're going to try and work things to get to that stage where we get persons to understand more. And that's why we like to do those programs, because it has to be an ongoing process. What we also find is that people may read things, but they don't read complete text. So, for example, we may be being threatened by, not necessarily threatened, but there's a possibility of a system developing somewhere in the Atlantic. Mm-hmm. And we may issue something, and the Met Office is looking at X, Y, and Z, 600 miles with the potential for development and whatever. People may just read that. At the bottom of the text, we may be saying, this system poses no threat to St. Martin. But people may not read right through, and they may not even see the section where we're saying that this system doesn't pose any threat to St. Martin. So they take that and they run with that, and they tell their neighbor, and they never tell the other person. And then all of a sudden it is all about the Met Department of St. Martin said a storm is coming, while the actual text would have been saying that it does not pose a threat to St. Martin. And we have to be careful, even sometimes on the graphics on the National Hurricane Center. How do you interpret the graphics? You may see graphics there, and you may just take a picture of the graphic, put it on your Facebook page, and say X, Y, and Z about it. But then what you may be saying and what the graphics may be interpreting is totally different. So we have to be very careful how we internalize information, and because you can really take a bit of information that's saying X and make it sound like it's saying A. So these are the things we try as much as possible to negate.
Right, like I'd indicated in the beginning, people becoming self-proclaimed meteorologists.
We have a lot of self. And the amazing thing about it is that these self-proclaimed meteorologists, a lot of times, they only come out of the cupboard with their results after the event. So they will say certain things. If it doesn't work, they keep quiet. And 1 in 10 times if something works, they'll say, "Oh, I always said it would happen," you know. But again, it's all exciting. We sometimes like when people call the office and they talk to the forecasters, and they may say that's what they're saying, or what is that, and so on, etc., etc. And so all an educational process.
Which is very interesting. I actually would like to talk about it. So you are seeing people, the citizens, interacting more with the Met Department, getting information, seeking the facts.
Yes, and I think even too that we have a lot more persons looking at following us on Facebook and Twitter, and sometimes making comments, and even not just the regular forecasts. Mm-hmm. But when we do things like we had a release on the eclipse, people follow those things very closely, you know. So it really boosts the transparency and the PR for the meteorological service. We also encourage a lot that schools come to visit the service, and when they come, they get a better appreciation of what we're doing. It's very difficult to bend old trees, but if you can get meteorology and you can get the information into the youth, even if they may be, let's say, 30% of the population, they have a significant influence on their parents and so on. So if you can get them to buy into what you're saying and know where to get the information and how to interpret a lot of the information, then it helps the society. So we work a lot with schools. We have special programs we have done for schools. We go out to schools and do presentations with them. And we also have a lot of schools that come in to the department to learn about meteorology. We even take it as far as looking at kids having a career in meteorology, because a lot of times people get the whole idea of meteorology wrong, and they don't understand it is actually a science. So what they see is they see somebody on TV reading this thing and saying the weather will do X, Y, and Z, and they think of meteorology as you being more a communications person and so on. And when they get to know that to be in meteorology, you're talking about a science, and you would need to have interest or very good background in maths and physics, then they get turned off, you know. So it's always good to get the youth to understand early, if you want to get into this field, what it is, what it's involved, and so on. So we have been doing a lot of work. I mean, like everything else, we have our limitations. And but I think so far, we from 2013 to now, we have done significant amount of work, and I think we're generally on the right path.
I was just going to say, to close off our segment with you, the development of the curriculum in school so that kids who are interested in the field, what they would have to focus on. We know that within our secondary school training, at third form, kids would have a choice between science and business. So reiterate again, what are the two areas? I think you mentioned two subjects
The
there.
two significant areas, it's meteorology is a science.
Correct.
And to understand the atmosphere and the dynamics of the atmosphere, you're basically dealing with maths and physics. If you don't like maths and physics and you cannot get through with maths and physics, then you're not into a career for meteorology. At the lower end of meteorology, which is basically observations, there's not too much maths. Also, although some of the institutions now realize that they need to start persons at that level in maths. But then if you really want to build a career in meteorology and be a forecaster also, the majority of it is maths and physics.
Final words as we head off into now what is the peak of the hurricane season 2017. What is your recommendations?
Preparation, preparation, preparation. And when you're fed up with preparation, you prepare again. It is as simple as that. There's a simple statement that disasters least affect the prepared. If you're prepared, you're going to negate the effect of any system on you. If you're not prepared, then you're going to be rushing around looking for things at last minute and so on, things you could have done before. I think sometimes we get our preparation a little bit too complicated, and our preparation can be simple. In other words, sometimes people get so confused that they're preparing for some storm going to affect the island, and they buy a lot of frozen things. If you're going to buy a lot of frozen things and you may not have power, why buy frozen things? You have to be able to assess your situation. You know the country. If you know you're going to be affected by a storm, you know after 1 or 2 days, the airport would be cleared, boats would be able to come in. So how much stuff you need, because things are going to be able to get in the island. One of the critical things I always say in terms of preparation is knowing your environment, knowing where you live, knowing where you work, knowing your routes from one to the other. And for example, you may have a storm, and based on the amount of rainfall in the storm, if you're living in a flat area, then you're going to be prone for flooding. Now, if you're on a hillside, you may not have that impact. So your routes in terms of where you live, are you going to be flooded out? What do you need to move before the system arrives in terms of if you're very close to the sea, generally you have the sea swells coming up before the winds and so on. So these are the sort of things. When I get information, how do I internalize it? What is the meaning of 2 inches of rainfall in 6 hours? 5 years ago, my area was flooded and they said it only had 1 inch. And that's how you internalize information. So if now you're going to have 2 inches, then you know it's most likely that you're going to have significant flooding in your area. And these are the sort of things that persons need to do. You need to internalize information. You need to have a sort of family plan. What's the excitement? Who's going to feed the animals? Who's going to take care of the necessary documents? Are we going to move with everything? Who's going to cover the computers? Instead of 2 persons looking to do one thing, if you have a simple plan and everybody knows their responsibility, then you're a lot more relaxed, even if the information happens to be late. And we have had situations just recently where we had flooding in St. Kitts, we had flooding in Totola, and those same events that caused the flooding in these islands could have caused flooding on St. Martin. And because of the dynamic nature of weather in our area, sometimes you have a close call and the system just moves a little north of you and you had a good day. But that same system could have dumped 2-3 inches of rainfall and you could have flooding. So yes, because it's not a perfect science, sometimes you may get a weather report from the Met Office, which is where you should get information from, that say there's a possibility of flooding. And it may not flood on that day. But then it just depends on what the system may have done, or just one cloud you expect of significant rainfall and it moved north or south of you. So these are the sort of things you have to listen to and be able, again, internalize information, know your environment, and know what you should do.
Head of the Meteorological Department, St. Martin, meteorologist Mr. Joseph Isaac, thank you so much for speaking to us in this edition of Inside Government. For more information to our radio listeners and television viewers, be sure to tune in to Inside Government as we continue in our program. We're going to cover climatology. We'll be speaking to meteorologist and forecaster Mrs. Cheryl LeBlanc coming up in just a few minutes. And also for more information, be sure to visit the meteosxm.com website. I believe I got that right. The meteosxm.com website for more information.
Stay tuned. You're watching Inside Government.
Welcome back. We are talking meteorology in this special edition of Inside Government. We just heard from the head of the department, Mr. Joseph Isaac, and now my second guest is forecaster and meteorologist, Ms. Cheryl LeBlanc. Cheryl, good to see you. Welcome Inside Government.
Thank you.
We want to talk to you and something that we've noticed coming into us on a regular basis. We get a climatology report. And we want to get into that. And as we learned from Mr. Isaac, meteorology is a science. And since I'm a candidate of the science, not meteorology, in a different area of communication, but I like the sciences. I want to understand a little bit more about climatology. Let's start first and foremost by defining it. What is it?
Okay, climatology. Maybe before I start saying what is climatology, maybe we should start with weather. Weather is the day-to-day experience that you get, whether it's sunny, rainy, cloudy. Now, climatology is the average. Most times we use 30 years, a 30-year average of the weather condition in any particular country or area. So we, in this particular part of the world, we are in the tropics. Our climate is warm with rainfall. Tropical climate, we say. Mm-hmm. So this is our climate. What you would normally experience, it's a 30-year average compared to weather, which is the day-to-day experience.
Now, looking at some of the reports that I find very interesting, key area, drought. When we speak about drought, you would never think that actually takes place within our region per se, but it in fact is possible. Tell us a little bit about that. How is that possible within the Caribbean region?
Drought is an ongoing situation when you have limited rainfall. You don't see it happening in a few weeks. It accumulates. Maybe after 6 months, you'll notice that your shrubs are getting drier, the hills are getting brown. This means that there's a deficiency in rainfall over your area. We had significant drought in the Caribbean, 2009, 2010, when most of the Caribbean islands were dried. Those who have a lot of rain, water, surface water, rivers were drying. Some countries had to purchase water from other countries. Mm. So this was the most recent one that we can remember. So drought is accumulating. Last year, we had a short period where we saw that we had increase in bushfires and so on. We had about 6 months where we had limited rainfall. But starting 2017, the rainfall started to come in about April, May. So now we are no longer in a drought concern for the short-term period.
Looking at last year to this year and further comparisons, how have things changed? What are we looking at in regard to the difference between the 2 years?
Last year at this time, we had less rainfall. So this year, from January to July, we are about 530 millimeters. That's at the airport. And this is above the average, which would it normally be from January to July. So we are above the normal range of the rainfall. So that's why we are a little greener this year. Last year at this time, we were browns everywhere.
How are things looking so far for the season when we're looking at hurricane season with regard to development of storms? Is that wind shear healthy out there right now?
Okay, this year, in terms of the ENSO or the La Nina and El Nino, we are in a period of a neutral state at this time. So we are neither El Nino nor La Nina. This doesn't affect anything. It doesn't increase our activity if the rainfall or temperatures at all. But for the hurricanes, that means it could go either way. If we are going into a La Nina, we know that the chances for increased storm development will come our way. But seeing that we were prepared for an El Nino, and the El Nino is the one that decreases our chances for storms, then where are we? There are chances that hurricane and storm development may increase this year. That is why NOAA increased their prediction at the last update, August 9th. They increased the chances of storm activities to 14 to 19 named storms, and we are already at it so far.
Well, so far we've been avoiding a lot of trouble for this season, so let's hopefully that it'll remain in that
let's hope
facet.
They stay away from our area.
Exactly. Cheryl, thank you so much for joining us for this edition of Inside Government and sharing your knowledge with us. We look forward to talking to you as, of course, the dynamics of weather always takes place, and we'll be checking in with you in the future for more information.
Thank you.
And to our radio listeners and television viewers, thank you for being a part of this edition of Inside Government. We invite you to log on to the official government website, stmartingov.org, for video on demand. And, of course, like us on Facebook. I'm Cedric Peterson on behalf of the Department of Communication and the Government of St. Martin. Thanks for tuning in.